Hi, everyone. Today, I'm going to talk to you about something that is actually really important to me and has become more near and dear to my heart. And I'm going to talk to you about inequities in health outcomes for Black women related to menopausal experiences as a result of structural racism. Yes, I know it sounds like a research topic. I am not researching it formally, but I am really investigating it more because it really does hit home for me. My name is Nikki Akbariwa, and I am a nurse entrepreneur, and I'm a health equity education coach. And this is right up my alley as an educator to speak power, truth to power when it comes to the experiences of Black menopausal women in our country. A lot of us don't know as much about it. So I want to take this opportunity to share. I will give you a complete disclosure. I am not an expert in any way on this. The only expertise I have is in my own lived experiences. And that is a space in which I'm going to speak from. But I hope that it is a space that you can also learn and take away from as well. So my first question, of course, is have you heard anything about menopause lately? And I asked this question because the moment I started looking into menopause and perimenopause and postmenopausal things, it started cropping up everywhere, as we are aware with Instagram and Facebook and TikTok. You name a social media platform and you feed it information, and then it just proliferates, right? And I found that to be really interesting because 10 years ago when I was, having these challenges, when I was telling my doctors about symptoms that I was having, I was not getting any kind of information, no guidance, no suggestions, no feedback, no nothing. And a lot of persons don't realize that perimenopause is real and that perimenopause can start. Especially in Black women, can start earlier and can start as early as your mid 30s. So if you've had questions or you've had thoughts, this is a great opportunity to sort of listen and learn about what menopause is, sort of all about, especially as it relates to Black women and some of the challenges that we have. So I do want to make a point in saying that, the reason I ask is, have you heard about it? Is that it's something that we're talking about more and more lately, right? We're hearing celebrities like, Oprah Winfrey and Gwyneth Paltrow, Kim Cattrall, Salma Hayek, Drew Barrymore, Michelle Obama, that are talking about this. Drew Barrymore is a known and pretty well loved person, and she came out and really started to try to normalize this whole conversation around menopause. And you're seeing more and more women, more and more persons stepping up and talking about menopause as something that requires urgency and is important not only for Black women, but for all women. So let's talk through a little bit more of the technical or social aspects of this, because as a health equity education coach, my domain really rests well in social justice, and we can't really create that justice if we don't have a good understanding. So this is a conceptual social justice or social determinants of health framework that was the idea of it is created by the World Health Organization. And it really is my way of looking at this whole process in a holistic way. So when we're looking at this process in a holistic way, especially all the social determinants of health, we're looking at socioeconomic, political, cultural, and contextual factors. We're looking at social hierarchy, structure, social class factors. We're looking at environmental, behavior, biological, and psychosocial factors as well. So if we start over to the left, we see that these are structural determinants. And structural determinants of health are really those upstream processes that occur that affect downstream actions. So if we want to understand how we're seeing increased chronic disease burden on Black women related to menopausal experiences, we have to first look upstream and see, well, what are some of the processes that are in place that could impact Black women? When we look at governance, we can recognize that according to the World Health Organization, health is a quote special good, and it is implicitly important to governance. Why? Because if we're healthier, we can work harder, we can contribute to the economy, right? If we're not as healthy, we aren't able to contribute as much to the economic economy. I'm not saying contributing period, but to that economic piece. White supremacy culture, we know, is also woven into governance. It's a part of the ways in which we set up our institutions, it's a part of our systems. It's a process that we don't have a lot of time to talk about today, so I won't. But I want you to understand that that is a part of our overall governing processes in this country, is through the lens of that. And then understand how, because of governance, there have been a lack of workplace protections or accommodations for menopausal women, efforts at political marginalization. Further, in sociopolitical policies, there has been and still continue to be stigma, silence, and shame around the menopausal transition. There's this increased financial strain or lack of economic capital that Black women experience, in addition to diminished returns on educational attainment. Labor market preferences are limited for Black women and their ability to even compete for jobs, and there's overrepresentation of Black women in service occupations. Further, when it comes to public policies, what we see is childhood socioeconomic disadvantage has influenced Black women, everyday discrimination. Black women are more likely to have worse physical built environments, less likely to be married, and more likely to have more children, also lacking social support, and who have also had experience with internalized racism. In these slides, I'll hope to share a little bit about, discrimination and access to power, prestige, and resources, how that's impacted Black women, what lower occupational based social class privilege has done, and how that's increased the risk of poor health outcomes and health behaviors, including increased major depressive symptoms in Black women. And then the crux of this is really talking about the environmental, behavioral, and biological burdens. So looking at the historical traumas of structural racism, including everyday discrimination, the impact of weathering on our bodies, and what allostatic load really is. So we're going to, drop into some of these, not all of these, but some of these. Okay. But we always have to start our conversation from the beginning. And the beginning of our conversation is really looking at the socio-political aspects of the upstream structural determinants of health. What we know is that menopause has really been thought of for the longest time as being something that's a shadow. We don't talk about it. And before we really stepped out of the shadows, menopausal women had been and continue to be, especially if they're Black women, largely ignored or marked as a burden or a taint on society. And ultimately, my argument here is that menopause was used as a form of social control of Black women. So whether we know it or not, and I'm not going to be talking about hormone replacement therapy much here at all, but what I will say is that estrogen actually grew out of a need to find a cure for male impotence. It had nothing to do originally with women's bodies, with what women were experiencing and going through. Menopause was initially described as insanity, right? Again, characterizing women as insane, unable to care for themselves. And one thing that I did want to share that I remember from a book, it was on the politics of menopause, the discovery of a deficiency disease. It cited menopausal women as living decay, right? And it said if women are perceived as physically and emotionally handicapped by menstruation and menopause, they cannot and may not compete with men. So again, this involves governance, this involves social control, much more stigma, much more shame, much more silence. And the person who during the 60s led the crusade to redefine menopause as a deficiency and as a disease was Robert A. Wilson, who received a $1.3 million grant. And at the time in the 60s, that was a lot of money. And it was his writings about women as living decay and lacking in feminine essence that were crucial to defining menopause as a disease. And it was he who really made it be where women were perceived as persons who did not have control and autonomy over their bodies. So again, we see the exercise of political and social control and efforts on women's bodies. Wondering how much of that has really changed. Well, when it comes to Black women and looking at structural determinants, looking at social hierarchy, social structure, and social class, it's important for us to know that politically, like I was saying, there's no federal law that requires employers to accommodate menopausal symptoms. As a matter of fact, there was a woman who did attempt to sue for an accommodation to the way she was, to her outfit, her uniform. She took it to court. they denied her. She ended up quitting her job because she was unable to do the work that she needed to do. So there are no federal protections. And further, for Black women, we're in a different category. We're already amongst the lowest wage earners in the country. So on a spectrum of white men to Black men to white women to Black women, that's the spectrum, that's the range. We earn less for the dollar for the same positions. And more often, Black women are perceived as unskilled laborers. We are more likely to be in essential roles. We're more likely to be on the front lines. Further, there's discrimination against us in terms of power, prestige, access to resources. This diminishes our social capital, and we've had diminished return on our educational attainment. So even though we've attained education, even though we're college educated, we have less returns on our college education than do, say, Black men or white women or white men, right? So in a study that was done across the nation, it was a study of women's health across the nation. It's a landmark study, longitudinal over about 20 years. What it showed was that Black women, even though they had, college education, they were more likely to report than white women that they were having difficulty paying for things such as basics like rent and paying for food. So what we're seeing all of this manifest into is that this is a lower occupational based class privilege that weakens Black women's social capital and increases their financial strains. So they're more likely to accumulate the highest levels of perceived interpersonal discrimination and higher everyday discrimination as well. And they have less positionality to move and to be able to get themselves into a better socially advantaged position. Like I've been saying, much of the spotlight on menopause is still focused on white cisgendered women to the deficit of Black and women of color. And in Menopause is Harder on Black Women, an author shares how menopause disproportionately affects Black women. And I want to share some of that with you here today. But before I share that, I want to talk a little bit about weathering. Have you heard of weathering? A lot of people have not really heard of weathering. So I'm going to share this with you. And I'm sharing this beautiful Black woman with you for a reason. I want you to remember her face as I talk to you about weathering. Weathering is where Blacks experience early health deterioration as a consequence of the cumulative impact. Catch that, cumulative, repeated impact or repeated experience with social or economic adversity and political marginalization. And this definition is by Arlene Geronimus, who has done amazing work around weathering, started this work, and she was sort of ostracized for it and finally was able to come back and talk about it more completely. But let me talk to you a little bit about what she says about the full impact of weathering for those of us who are nurses or not. With weathering and the cumulative impact of repeated experience of adversity and marginalization, what happens is it changes functioning inside the body. So if you're more likely to be hypervigilant because you're more likely to be exposed to racism or discrimination or perceived as a threat, then it alters your fight or flight mechanisms. You will engage in additional or more exaggerated fight or flight. When we enter fight or flight, we have hormones that get released into our body, like cortisol. Cortisol gets us ready to move, but it also drains our body as well. When we have cortisol released into our body, it constricts our vessels, right? Including the vessels in the heart, causing what? Hypertension. What do we know that Black persons are more likely to experience? Hypertension. It also changes inflammatory pathways in our body. So if we're more likely to be inflamed, that causes inflammation all over the body, including in our hearts, cardiovascular disease. Black persons more likely to have cardiovascular disease. If we are running from something, we need more insulin, which is sugar in our body, so that we can be ready to run. Insulin resistance is a huge thing. If you have more circulating insulin in the body and you're not actually using it, what does that cause? That causes diabetes. Say it with me. Black persons are more likely to be diabetic. Okay. So really what we're talking here about is impacts over several different systems in the body that make it more difficult for Black persons to overcome illness when they do have illnesses. So you remember that picture of the beautiful Black woman that I showed you? According to Geronimus, we may appear to be 30 years old on the outside, but because of the manifestations of weathering on our bodies, our internal systems and organs may actually be 50 years old. So I know we say black don't crack, and I know we keep looking great, but internally there is long-term damage and long-term consequences to weathering. Now, when it comes to the menopausal transition, Black women have a statistically significant 8.5 months earlier median age at menopause than white women. An earlier age at menopause is clinically relevant because there is an association with increased risk of cardiovascular disease and mortality. Black women are also 50% more likely to have vasomotor symptoms, which are hot flashes, night sweats, sleep disturbances. And the incidence of vasomotor symptoms was greater in the SWAN study in Black versus white participants in every stage of the menopausal transition. Okay. That means that increases in frequency of the symptoms, bothersome level of the symptoms, and duration. For this study, Black women were going through the menopausal transition for 10 years as opposed to 6.5 years for white women. And Black women had clinically significant depressive symptoms, but were less likely to be treated for it, including emotional problems and psychotherapy, as well as psychotherapeutic medication. And we know depression is a risk factor for diabetes and heart disease, outcomes known to be more prevalent in Black women. Object measured poor sleep quality also was reported because vasomotor symptoms are associated with more sleep disturbances and also more greater cardiovascular disease. So looking more at the impact of weathering with this SWAN study on the health burdens of Black women, what we can see is that when we compare Black women to white women in this cohort study, that for every instance of disease, Black women fared worse, whether it was poor self-reported health, obesity, metabolic syndrome, hypertension, right? And allostatic load. Allostatic load is what I was essentially describing when I was talking about weathering. Allostatic load is a cluster measure of physiologic dysregulation across multiple systems, such as your cardiovascular system, your metabolic system, your inflammatory system, your neuroendocrine system. So for every level, Black women had worsening experiences. And then when we look at intermediary determinants or those environmental, behavioral, and psychosocial factors, it's important for us to recognize that everyday discrimination is a factor. Black participants had less education, greater cigarette use, and more unemployment, which are known to be influenced by structural racism. And it was also associated with earlier age at final menstrual period. Also, cigarette use in Blacks is consistent with disproportionate advertising and access to tobacco products. Further to note, the American Cancer Association did also indicate that the more highly addictive menthol cigarettes were more likely to be sold in Black and urban neighborhoods as well. Black these women had lower levels of physical activity because of most likely because of less leisure time. If you have increased financial strain and ability to pay for basics like food and rent, you have to work, right? Where's the leisure time? Also, this may be attributable to the higher likelihood of Black women living in less safe communities with reduced access to green spaces, which is also shown to have an impact on age at final menstrual period to bring it on 1.4 years earlier, to bring on menopause 1.4 years earlier because of lack of access to green space and pollutants, air pollution. So Black women were more likely to report life contexts that increase, right, the risk for earlier menopause or more vasomotor symptoms or greater chronic disease burden. So they were more likely to report not being married or having more children or, being smoking more, being unemployed. They were more likely. And I don't want us to forget also the impact of internalized racism, which is those feelings of isolation, shame, despair, and guilt. And we know that these things are contributing factors because of structural racism. But we know that menopause is having a moment, right? Currently, there's a lot more awareness around menopause. September is Menopause Awareness Month, and October celebrates National World Menopause Day. And what has been defined as a menopause gold rush is where venture capitalists have converged on this new frontier, and we're calling it now women's wellness. So, where we were calling it a disease and living decay and lacking feminine essence, we've shifted the narrative and we're focusing on how does this impact women's wellness. It's an excellent capitalist opportunity, right? As a matter of fact, a woman by the name of Alicia Jackson, she's a CEO of Evernow, a white woman, sought out a friend in Silicon Valley and said, "Hey, I'm really wanting to push this menopause agenda. Can you help?" And this friend immediately gave her $1 million to do this. Now, my question to you is, do Black women have these connections with venture capitalists where they're able to seek support and ask for the things that they need? But what we can see here is that there is becoming more diversity and expression around menopause. We're seeing more persons younger coming around and really talking about it. And these women here, Naomi Watts and Katie Couric and Tamsin Fidel and Lisa Volkman and Natalie Nixon all were a part of this menopause symposium. And look at the joy that they have. I think that's beautiful. But the person I'm really excited to share with you about is the founder of the Black Girl's Guide to Surviving Menopause. Her name is Omasade Bernays Scott. And she has created this phenomenal experience, this podcast, where she's addressing women intergenerationally, Black women intergenerationally, cisgender, non-heteronormative women, to help build this movement around social cohesion and social capital, to strengthen ancestral identities and honor all Black women's bodies as they journey through menopause. She talks about something called spiritual retainers, and it just was such an amazing process and practice to me. I think it's something that I want to keep doing for myself and to invest in for others. It promotes belonging. And in spiritual retainers, what she's talking about is we hold space for each other. And I'm making an investment in you with my time, my energy, the words that I say, how I show up to you, and I want the same investment back. And what a beautiful bond she's been creating. And she's inviting persons to contribute to the work that she's doing. So I ask that you support her. I know I certainly will support her. And I want you to learn more about how Black women can survive menopause and how we can come out on the other side with less, hopefully less burden of chronic disease as we do this work together. So remember, it's all about caring. It's all about being the change that you wish to see in the world. I invite you at this time to join our Healing Space Dialogue, because the work that I'm doing with health equity and coaching is really all a healing journey. And our next healing dialogue is going to be on December 9th at 11:30 a.m. If you're interested, you can scan this QR code. It'll pop up. You can register for it. It's going to be on Zoom. We create healing space to talk about traumas of structural racism, traumas of institutional barriers, right? Traumas around things like this, around menopause, and around our journey. So if this is something that's been interesting to you, please join us for that experience. I look forward to seeing you there. Thanks so much for taking the time.